On behalf of the 50th anniversary of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Committee, I welcome you all here tonight. This event is one of many organised by this committee. In the past 18 months, to mark the founding of NICRA in '67 through the those marches that we organised in places like Uri, Coleraine, Duncairn and Derry. The committee was founded to make sense of all that 50 years on and to try and understand what happened and what we were about at the time for younger people, to put it on record what it really was all about. Much has been said about the role of Republicans and the Republican movement in the 1960s Civil Rights Association. Here tonight, we examine the role from the end of the 1950 border campaign to the beginning of violence in 1969. Several of our panellists tonight have a first-class insight, as they were both members of NICRA and members of the Republican movement at the time. Much has been said and written about, especially from elements within unionism, about the role of the Republican movement in NICRA. It was certainly there, but it was there for all the really important reasons and all to drive this society forward. It was there for nothing else. And I would like to hand you over to Michael Donnelly, President of the Workers' Party and lecturer in politics at Galway University. He has a broad idea of the period of both the Republican movement and NICRA. So I would like to Mickey to kick off tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, okay, folks, can you hear me down at the back? I've been told I have very soft, dulcet tones, you know. So, but yes, there's a thing over here, and I want to talk tonight, not simply or merely about the detail of what happened in the civil rights movement, or indeed within the Republican movement, the forerunner to today's Workers' Party, and indeed the events following on from 1956-62, the so-called ill-fated border campaign, were largely instrumental in leading to indeed the formation of the civil rights movement, as well as the completely new direction by the Republican movement that led to the formation of the Workers' Party. And that's what I want to talk about. So, the reasoning that motivated that shift was, in effect, a shift away from pure, simple, and traditional militarism that had long dominated the thinking of the post-Civil War IRA, and indeed, perhaps right from the time that Donnelly died, etc. And despite all the prior belief and hope that the leadership at the time had invested, if you like, in that campaign between 56 and 62, it had been little short of a disaster. And as an internal IRA document later admitted, the then leadership had hopelessly overestimated the degree of public support. And just in case you think I'm leaking some privileged information, I am eternally grateful to the last unionist government of Northern Ireland for releasing this particular piece of information. In fact, it was read into the record by Bill Craig at the time of the civil rights and trying to create that slur, etc. But it's an important document because it was written by people who were looking at the, if you like, the post-mortem of that colossal failure of 56-62. And it referred to, and I quote, a dwindling public support, both north and south, making it virtually impossible for men, and it was gender, to operate on guerrilla lines. It came then to another part that said this comes only from an awareness and understanding of the reasons and nature of the struggle. And it basically stated that if people did not understand the nature of the freedom for which they were fighting for, then, and to make that freedom worthy of their support, then it simply was a failure. And so, while initially, at any rate, in the aftermath of that particular campaign, the intense discussions that followed on from it focused really on the tactical weaknesses and possible strengths, etc. It developed into a deeper, indeed a wider discussion about what it was that the Republican movement, the then Republican movement, actually represented. If it wasn't connecting with the people, what was it that wasn't connecting? Was it organisational, or was it the ideal itself that was not connecting? And they claimed to be fighting on behalf of the people, etc. Now, the question was this simply as a consequence of tactical errors, miscalculations, or were there reasons that ran much deeper than that? And as the debate intensified, it eventually brought into focus the whole question of what exactly was it they were fighting for, and indeed the question, who are we? What do we represent? What do we stand for? And if the people then were not with us, why not? The obvious question. And in addressing that lack of popular support, the then Republican leadership, by then, under the leadership of Cathal Goulding and Sean Garland and others, etc., were increasingly argued that as popular support was necessary, was essential, then how does the Republican movement go about in garnering that support? And one of the first conclusions that they came to in that discussion was that it could not come through elitist forms of militarism. They were not, I hasten to add, arguing that militarism in itself was wrong or in any way abhorrent, but militarism without a strong popular base and in support, in particular, in support of a radical socio-economic and political programme would be self-defeating and ultimately doomed, just as much as the political vacuous 56-62 campaign was. So increasingly, they were focusing on the whole nature of the freedom so frequently invoked in Republican literature, in propaganda and statements, going right back into from the Civil War, before the Civil War, the War of Independence, 1916, etc., the Fenians, etc. This freedom, what does it mean? What is freedom? And they sought to tease out this freedom further, to tease it out more, to make it more fulsome, to make it tangible and real, to make it concrete and in specific terms that would have meaning, greater meaning for ordinary people within their daily lives. So if the freedom that they were fighting for was to have values and meanings that were relevant to the people, then it had to mean something significantly more than mere dancing at De Valera's fictional crossroads. And the issues then, in both parts of Ireland, were staring them in the face. Unemployment, poverty, low wages, a housing crisis, same elements that we have both north and south today in this country, and all as a consequence of social exploitation along very stark, naked class lines. Those added to a deeply sectarian state in Northern Ireland were the stark political realities of the time. So for the Republican movement, the then Republican movement, to make itself relevant again, it would have to, at the very least, frame its future actions and its activities around those very issues. It could not avoid doing that. And it now had reached that level of understanding that its failure to so frame its actions in the border campaign had been seen as irrelevant by the very people whose interests it was supposedly being carried out and fought for. So, in understanding that the primary issues, therefore, were in fact class-based ones, their subsequent reasoning and their analyses quickly led them to radically shifting their worldview and away from what we could call intellectually impoverished forms of nationalism, and increasingly towards the more radical Marxist critique of Irish society. This would now form the intellectual base, the base of ideas from which the actions and policies would spring for the new Republican movement. It also brought them to increasingly towards the Leninist model of the Revolutionary Party, not as a set of principles, but as a revolutionary instrument, an instrument by which the revolution itself would be achieved. The Socialist Republic was now entering into the rhetoric of the Republican movement, and it was increasingly putting the primacy of the political over the military. And this, therefore, represented a crucial moment for the Republican movement at that time. So, what had initially begun as a critical examination of purely tactical questions had shifted quite radically towards what can only be described as a pivotal moment in its history and its development. Having rediscovered social class, and rediscovered social class as the primary motor of political history and change, more critically, they had embraced Marxism as the critical theoretical model and Lenin's vanguard as its vital organisational form. So what, in effect, had initially started as a review of tactics had ended in a completely new form of strategic political thinking. And in real time, what that meant was a fundamental shift away from elitism, and particularly from the elitism of sheer militarism, and an insistence upon its members, its activists, being active on the social and economic fronts as well as the political fronts. It meant, too, that members would be expected to become active within their communities on the issues that confronted working people, particularly working people, working with them, organising them, agitating with them, organising them for change, for rights, for jobs, for houses, etc. In short, seeking both to mobilise and to radicalise them into political activism, to end the pacifism of the working class. They correctly understood that the social and the economic were inseparable from the political, and none could be confronted in isolation. In making this paradigmatic shift, the new leadership was not simply seeking to broaden the support base and membership of the Republican movement, but, as I stated earlier, to radically shift its focus away from rhetorical, sterile, romantic nationalism, a nationalism that often came wrapped in the Catholic images and ceremonies that it had slipped into since the failure, in particular, of the Republican Congress in the 1930s. Anyone who knew Sean Garland would be well aware how he looked towards the 1936, as did Goulding, etc. What were they doing? It wasn't just the Republican Congress. They were looking back to 1916. They were looking back in particular to James Connolly. And Connolly's radical Marxism that had informed his role within the Easter Rebellion. That, in the very rubble of Dublin in that period, and subsequently in the Civil War, it seemed as if Connolly's ideas had been buried along with his bones. But his ideas never died. And in looking back at that, in tapping into that radical Marxism that Connolly had articulated and wrote so extensively about, they were seeking to capture that and to inject it, and to inject that radicalism once more back into the Irish body politic. That was the strategy, and that was the significant strategic shift. It meant, therefore, asserting the primacy of radical politics, of radical class politics over pure militarism. And in taking that route, it also pushed them into the whole area of human and civil liberties. And this was a period when human and civil liberties were forming part of the critique of capitalist society. Civil rights demonstrations in America along ethnic lines, etc. Civil liberties groups in Britain and indeed in Northern Ireland. And of course, leading into and feeding into the subsequent Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And it was this interaction between the movement then, shifting not just its focus, but its primary ideological base as well, in order to be relevant to working class people, that it sought to lead. And engaging directly with the social and the political context that ultimately gave rise to the idea of a civil rights movement itself, specifically for Northern Ireland. A movement they viewed as a strategic, indeed essential, preliminary stage in the development of class consciousness in Northern Ireland. So civil rights was never, ever a simple end in itself. And those of you who are aware of it will know that the Wolf Tone societies, for example, as far back as 1963, as part of that critical debate, the broadening of the base of the Republican movement, people like Garland and Goulding bringing new people in, new ideas, new energies, new enthusiasms, and focusing on the very issues that confronted ordinary people. And it was the Wolf Tone societies that provided the later impetus by 1966 at the famous meeting in Maghera to actually make a decision to form a civil rights movement. The Republican movement played a critical role, not just in its organisation and its founding, but in the thinking that gave rise to that particular model of protest. And in that sense, it was addressing the realities of the sectarian state in Northern Ireland. It's not my task here tonight to talk about Northern Ireland's foundation and talking about the role of Irish nationalism and British nationalism, etc. But the fact remained the state came into being. But it came into being in a way that even for those admirers of the liberal democratic model of the state did not behave as a liberal democratic state. It was an ethnic state, controlled by a unionist party that played the ethnic card, etc. And so there were sectarianisms at the heart of that state. And from its very beginning, the state was posited in a way that insofar as its government could do and give effect to, it bestowed, however marginal, it bestowed distinctive advantages to people who supported it, the British nationalist bloc within Northern Ireland. And these differences, these advantages are extraordinarily difficult to measure. But certainly in the subjective sense, many people who came from what we would call an Irish nationalist background felt as second-class citizens. And what is important about this is that it was a stark reality confronting the Republican movement as well, in seeking to mobilise people along class lines, confronting a deeply divided working class in Northern Ireland. One thing raising class consciousness in the south of Ireland, but in the north of Ireland, a divided working class was a doubly problematical difficulty. And so politically, this ethno-sectarian nature of the state was itself a major obstacle to the development of pure class consciousness. And in that sense, the Republican movement recognized that the civil rights movement itself would be an important instrument to change that, to create a sense of equality, not based on advantage to one ethnic bloc or the other, was a hurdle that had to be overcome before class unity itself could occur. And that is an essential part of the thinking that informed the Republican movement at that time, and particularly the new leadership. So civil rights was seen as a critical means towards a new end, etc. Now, I'm not in any way claiming here that the Republican movement had sole proprietary rights over the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. That is simply incorrect. We acknowledge there were others, individuals and other groups, but the thinking and the organisational formats and many of the personnel were provided by the Republican movement under Garland and Goulding's direction, and played a critical and informative role both to the idea of it and its actual coming into being. There's another comment that I feel must be made in relation to that as well, in terms of the thinking and the strategy by the movement in the 1960s. It's one that sometimes comes in even to the formal literature, and which is fundamentally incorrect, and it states that by developing and setting up and being involved in NICTRA, that this was merely a tactical shift by the Republican movement, partly recognising what I've said earlier, that they had lost contact with a popular base, and it was seeking somehow to create a popular base by tagging on to the civil rights question. In a sense that through that, to gain sufficient public support to recommence its traditional armed campaign, the reassertion of the militarism, pure militarism, etc. Then events subsequent to the foundation of NICRA show this to be completely and utterly erroneous, and indeed to be false. Both Garland and Goulding, as well as Liam Macmillan in Belfast, people like Desi O'Hagan, Malachi McGurran, and others, even when the sectarian ethnic flame erupted in Northern Ireland from 1969 in particular, they refused to use that ethnic mobilisation to be the fuel that would drive the new strategy of the Republican movement with its new ideological core, etc. They were not prepared to allow it to go back to the old ways. And the simple reason was, the primary reason for mobilising within the civil rights, apart from the ending of inequalities, was to create the basis of a class unity which was quintessential to the programme of the radical socialist republic that they sought to build. And the instrument, the new Workers' Party that was an embryo at that time, would be the primary instrument for its deliverance. But it could only do so at the head, as the vanguard of a united working class. And that unification of the working class was the ideal, and it remains the ideal of those people who initiated that particular strategy in the 1960s, etc. And that's it. I have nothing more to say. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie.